Thank you for tuning in today for session one of our very first Project Drawdown deep dive. How can we halt and reverse deforestation in this decade? My name is Tina Swanson, and I'm Senior Scientist for Policy and Private Sector Partnerships at Project Drawdown, the world's leading resource for science-based climate solutions. I'll be your MC today. My Project Drawdown team is backstage with me, and we're going to make sure that everything runs smoothly. Before we get started with the program, please let me go over a few housekeeping logistics. We're presenting this deep dive using the Zoom meeting format. Each of you will show up as a participant and we'll be spotlighting our speakers and their slide presentations. Please feel free to use the closed caption if this will enhance your experience. We will have Q&A opportunities throughout today's presentation. Please use the chat to send us your questions and comments, which will come directly to our team to limit distractions during the presentations. All questions will be answered anonymously, and if there are more questions than we have time for, we may summarize some additional Q&A in our written follow-up after the deep dive. We'll operate under Chatham House rule, meaning that you're free to use any information received, but should not reveal the identities or affiliations of participants. A recap of this session, along with resources and recording, will be shared in the coming weeks. If you have any resources that you would like to share with the audience, please share via chat or send them to your Project Drawdown contact. And with that, it is now my great pleasure to introduce Dr. Jonathan Foley, Executive Director of Project Drawdown, who will kick us off. John, take it away.
Great. Thank you, Tina. And thank you all for being here today. I'm glad that we're able to have this presentation for the APAC time zones. So thank you all so much for being here today. So let me just throw up my presentation very quickly and we can get started. So again, I want to offer a welcome. Again, I'm John Foley, the Executive Director of Project Drawdown, and we're very, very happy to be a part of this offering today. These are what we're calling a series of so-called deep dives. These are sessions intended to focus on critical, what we call emergency brake style climate measures that are needed to address climate change effectively and quickly in the coming years and decades. So these emergency brakes are big, they're fast, and they're effective, and they can help get us back on track to addressing climate change with something like a Paris Accords outcome. We are going to be exploring these high priority climate solutions, and today we're going to go over some of the key scientific backgrounds that we need to understand, some of these policy kind of areas we need to understand, as well as key strategies for affecting the future. And today's topic is going to be around tropical deforestation. Now, what we hope for today is that we're going to be engaging audiences last week and this week of business leaders, investors, impact investors especially, and philanthropists. And the idea is that collectively we can unlock and accelerate these kinds of climate actions. So you hopefully are the folks that can help deploy solutions into the future, and we in the nonprofit world are hoping to inform that deployment as best we can. So our mission today is to have a conversation about how we can halt and eventually reverse tropical deforestation in the coming decade. And we're so pleased to be partnering with three really important organizations today. Today, you're going to hear a lot about the Forest People Climate Collaborative, which is a global collaborative of philanthropic donors, civil society organizations, and community-based organizations that are seeking to halt and reverse tropical deforestation while also supporting a just and sustainable development future. The FPC Collaborative is hosted by a great organization called the Climate and Land Use Alliance, a network of global philanthropies focusing on, obviously, land use and climate change. And their FPC strategic framework provides that kind of roadmap for action and ensures that funding flows to the areas that are needed most. We're also partnering with Climate Lead, or CLI, as it used to be called, another organization focusing on philanthropies and climate in the future. We're also very, very, very pleased to be working with Tonic and APC, who are on the call today, two of our partners of the Drawdown Capital Coalition. So I want to give them a special shout out today, some of our most important partners. So after the welcome here, I wanted to offer a kind of a quick scientific primer on forest and why they're so important. So this is going to be a crash course very quickly on the importance of tropical forests and their links to climate change. And I will be in some very, very short little punchy chapters. But the first is really talk about, well, what on earth is a forest after all? We all know what trees are, and we know the forests are some sort of collection of trees. And I bet we'd all agree that this photo represents a photo of a forest, of course. But does this, to what extent do human encroachments in the forest stop making a forest a forest? Or to what extent do we clear a landscape and it's no longer considered a forest? It's now human dominated agriculture or pasture, for example. Well, scientists have been to work at this and have actually come up with a formal definition of what forests are. They're land covered in trees, at least half a hectare in size, where the trees reach about 5 meters in height and cover the ground with about 10% foliage or canopy cover. So that's the minimum requirement to be a forest. Okay, that's fair. Now, where are these forests? Well, Earth still has a lot of forests, not as much as it used to, but we do have 4 billion hectares of land covered in forest on Earth today, which is about 30% of all the land on Earth. If we were to kind of ask a satellite to map where forests are, we could make these sort of very fancy green maps of forest cover. This is one actually used using a NASA satellite that uses a laser beam shot down from a satellite that can measure very precisely the height of trees on Earth. So this is a measurement of tree cover on Earth. The darker the green means the taller the tree canopy. But let's zoom around different parts of the world. I live here in North America, for example, so I'm pretty familiar with that. We have the Appalachian Forest coming in the East Coast, heading up to New England and to Nova Scotia and Quebec. And of course, the large taiga or boreal forest extending across Canada. And of course, the the temperate rainforest of the Pacific Northwest, going into the redwoods and other things in California and beyond. So we can see a lot of familiar forests to North Americans. We can scoot over to Europe and see the beginning of the great temperate forest of Europe and Fennoscandia, but also the great boreal forest of Russia and the USSR region, of course, here extending into Siberia. So those are some of the northern hemisphere forests that we know and love. But today we're going to be focusing mainly on tropical forests, in particular 3 regions, especially the Amazon region here, mainly Brazil, but other countries that feed the Amazon drainage basin and these very dense large forests. We have the forest of West Africa and the Congo Basin here in Africa are very grave concern as well. And of course, forest here in Southeast Asia through the Indonesian archipelago from Malaysia, Singapore, Indonesia, Papua New Guinea, and the rest, of course, here, this very large collection of islands that are forested. And we can step back and see all of these again here. We generally define this region of the world as being the tropical forest, not defined by latitude, but rather by climatic conditions. These are forests that don't experience freezing temperatures very much. The temperate belt up here in the northern and southern hemispheres, and in the northern hemisphere, a third belt of forest, the boreal or high northern forest of Canada and Russia. So that's just a little bit of orientation to the geography of these incredible forests. Now, why are they important? Well, forests are important for many critical reasons. First, to a lot of people's mind, is their role in harboring life and biological diversity. Again and again, we find tremendous rich collections of species of very different kinds of creatures all around the world, but mainly in these forests, especially tropical forest. So here, for example, are maps of avian or bird biodiversity showing incredible concentrations in different parts of the Amazon basin or the East African Rift Lake regions or Southeast Asia. We can look at mammal biodiversity here and see, incredible rich collections of mammal species all around these forests, amphibians, and so on. And we can map these all day long and show again and again that these forests tend to be harbors of incredible rich diversities of life. But beyond just the diversity of these species, they also provide critical services in the environment, many of which we humans depend on. One I just wanted to show as an example is kind of a little odd, maybe, but is the idea of disease regulation. The concept here is that healthy ecosystems, where predators and prey and insect vectors and viruses and bacteria and plasmodia and all these things that are part of a natural ecology of disease, are regulated in a healthy forest. But when we deforest a place, when we go in changing the landscape and degrading it, often the diseases get out of check compared to their natural environment and sometimes get unleashed into the human population. The vast majority of diseases we've come to know in the last century came from animals, often from wild populations and often from these tropical forests. In fact, recently there's been evidence linking Ebola outbreaks with the degradation of closed canopy forest. So we're beginning to understand that when we disrupt the ecology of even things like disease organisms and their vectors, we can sometimes pay the price for that later. Forests also do other important things like help cycle water. Forests are essentially a large pump that takes water out of the soil, driving it into the atmosphere through what's called evapotranspiration. Just a fancy word for how water pours up through a tree, out of its stomates, out of its leaves, back into the atmosphere, essentially recycling the water that fell in as rain before. But when you clear a forest, the ability of the landscape to recycle that water again is diminished. Grasses and shrubs just don't have the deep roots or the ability to pump water nearly as much as a healthy forest, and so leaves these landscapes, relatively speaking, hot and dry compared to moist, wet forest. And we can see all over the world how forests play a role in recycling the rain that falls somewhere else. For example, these regions have high abilities to, like the Amazon and West Africa, are crucial in recycling water downwind of them. So the forest, it rains there, the water's pumped up again and blown downwind where it can fall once more, providing a crucial water source to many parts of the world. And so, frankly, in many parts of the world, see over half of the rainfall was recycled from somewhere upwind of them on land, primarily by landscapes with forest. But while we're all here today, the primary reason we're going to be talking about forests is probably in relation to their stores of carbon, because carbon, as you know, is a part of climate change. When we burn coal or oil or gas or any of those carbon compounds, they become carbon dioxide going into the atmosphere. The same thing's true if you burn living tissue, especially trees. The carbon in living tissue also burns and becomes carbon dioxide, contributing to climate change, just like burning coal. And the living biosphere, especially forest, contain a lot of carbon. This is a map estimating the density of carbon in tons of carbon per hectare across the forest in the world. Now, all of these areas, tropical forests are absolutely crucial to our future, whether it's for biodiversity, whether it's for recycling water, keeping diseases in check, or storing carbon. Again and again, these tropical forests seem to be especially important to us. Again, as centers for biodiversity, ecosystem services, water, carbon, and so on. And carbon in particular, just think tropical forest, about a third of our forest land altogether, is about 10% of Earth's land, but it does 25% of all the land-based photosynthesis, and it contains about 40% of all the plant biomass on land. So these forests are disproportionately important to the regulation of our climate and the biosphere as a whole. So why are we concerned about this? It's simple. We're losing forest. We're clearing them. Over the last couple of centuries, we have started to use more and more land for human use, whether it's agriculture or cities or mining or timber, other things that we use land for. It's been steadily increasing since the 18th century. More recently, we've been using tropical forest. Early on, much of the loss of land for human activities was in the temperate zone. But more recently, tropical forest loss has accelerated, especially after the 1970s. And we see today that we've lost nearly 30% of the world's tropical forest that was here before and still going. Well, where are we losing forest around the world? Fortunately, scientists have been tracking this using satellites for a number of decades now, and we have very good data telling us where we've been losing forest, where we might actually be gaining a little forest, and landscapes where both things are going on, where we're losing and gaining forest at the same time. These maps show the changes in forest between the year 2000 and the year 2023. That'll be updated again for 2024 very soon, of course. And it's produced by Matt Hansen and his team at the University of Maryland, which I think is the leading place on Earth that really tracks this stuff. What you'll see is the red areas of here in North America, for example, are places where forests are clearly lost during that time. For example, Canadian wildfires and California wildfires have lost a tremendous amount of forest to fire. The blue areas, not too many of those, are places where forests have come back and been gained. And these purple areas in the southeastern United States are a mixture of red and blue, where we lose forest and then it grows back again. That's ongoing forest management. These are essentially plantations that are cut, replanted and then cut again on a very short cycle. So we're seeing that kind of forest management in purple. Here in Europe and in Siberia, we can see some forest loss, of course, as well, especially in Siberia, or increased forest fires. Kind of a pattern we're seeing across Canada and Siberia and the Western North American region. We're seeing a lot more forest fires and beetle outbreaks, but especially fires later that are showing up in the last 2.5 decades. But let's go to the tropical forests where we are focused most of all. And we can see here clear human fingerprints of land use. For example, if we zoom into the Amazon basin, we can see this kind of strange road pattern, almost a fishbone pattern, we call it, of deforestation. At the center of the screen, you'll see a road going from south to north. That road is called BR 163. It's a road that connects basically Mato Grosso, which is a large soybean producing region to the south, to the city of Santarém, which is a deep water port on the Amazon River. Soybeans are shipped north into that port and then shipped out on boats to the rest of the world, particularly to Asia, for animal feed. So that road helped accelerate deforestation marching northward. And you can see how every road begets another road and another road after that. At the end of each, you'll find a cleared forest. So roads are kind of critical in the Amazonian story of deforestation, as you'll see in the next few slides. When we go to Africa, we can see different patterns of deforestation, whether it's in West Africa here, where you see a lot of extensive forest loss, or we go to the Congo Basin, where we're seeing some very severe forest loss on the edges and on the riparian river areas of the Congo Basin. And those are areas of extreme concern. Of course, over in Southeast Asia and the Indonesian archipelago, we see quite a lot of forest loss, but also what appears to be the loss and then planting back of forest. But these are often natural forests replanted as palm oil plantations or other kind of forest plantations, not at all a natural forest. But we can see these patterns, especially along the coastlines and the low-lying areas here across Indonesia and beyond. So what's driving this forest loss? Well, it turns out it's different things in different places that you might expect, but mostly to first order, forests are being cleared for agriculture. Most of the forest lands of the world that we're seeing lost are for agriculture, whether it's for like beef or palm oil or soybeans or things like this. That is a big story around the world. But of course, the other things too, including forest products and forest clearing for fiber and so on, as well as mining areas. And we can look at this and begin to see kind of patterns of different land use practices, especially in agriculture, by looking at the typical size of land parcels. For example, the big blue areas in Brazil, for example, like Pará, Mato Grosso, those areas, Minas Gerais, those states you see in Brazil, those are very large quantities of land being farmed at the same time, very large land operations, mainly for soybeans and cattle. In West Africa and around the Congo, we suddenly see very smallholder agriculture being the primary unit of land here, and what was historically driving deforestation there at first. But land is getting to be a little bit more consolidated and a little more large commodity agriculture beginning to enter the Congo Basin and West Africa. Indonesia is kind of an interesting mix. It is commodity agriculture, but small land holdings for the most part, unlike Brazil. We can also kind of ask, what's really driving deforestation on the ground? And this data set by Curtis et al. In 2018, a little bit out of date now, but the same story mainly appears that large commodity agriculture in red driving deforestation in the Amazon region, maybe more smallholders across Africa. And again, in Southeast Asia and Indonesia, we see mainly commodity agriculture being the primary driver once more. So deforestation is driven in each region by different forces, and we have to understand each of those to understand what we need to do to stop deforestation. If we don't know the cause of deforestation, it's hard to find the cure. So in the future, when we talk about the Forest People Climate Initiative, they've done some really brilliant work that focuses our attention on 3 key regions. And the regions you're going to hear from them about are the Brazilian Amazon. Now, the Amazon, of course, covers many other countries, but the Brazilian Amazon is the largest fraction of that, and the area that's being cleared primarily by these large soybean and beef operations. We're also going to look at the Congo Basin. Yes, West Africa, Madagascar, and other areas are also being deforested, but this is a huge fraction of the remaining tropical forest and of critical strategic importance. And of course, the Indonesian region, all over this place. One's more focusing on kind of a large central area forest. Now, those are the key regions. Now, what's driving forest loss in each of them? Again, Forest People Climate, or FPC, will tell you much more about this in their detailed research. But just to give you a first order glance, in the Brazilian Amazon, beef is a driver of deforestation, as well as soybeans. By the way, the soybeans aren't for human consumption. They're mainly for animal feed, primarily being shipped to China and other Asian markets for pork production. So animal agriculture is the biggest driver, I would say, of Amazonian deforestation. Over in Indonesia, of course, oil palm is a significant driver of deforestation in this region. And in the Congo Basin, it's often shifting cultivation, but increasingly things like commodity agriculture, including oil palm. So we have a kind of different stories in each region, and we have to really address them all separately with different kinds of strategies. And that's exactly what FPC is doing. Now, let's look at the links between forest and climate to get a little bit more precise about what we need to do. Deforestation is a big driver of climate change. As I mentioned before, a forest will burn just like burning coal or gas or oil and releases carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. These emissions are very important. Now, the entirety of food, agriculture, and land use altogether is about 22% of the world's greenhouse gas emissions. That's about as much as all the world's electricity, or almost as much as the world's industry. So food, land use, and agriculture all tied together are very large contributors to climate change. Of that, zooming in a little bit more, by far the biggest contributor of this is deforestation itself at 11%. Let's just click in this. Deforestation on Earth today, primarily these tropical forests, releases about 11% of the world's greenhouse gases. To put that in comparison, the United States economy only emits 10.5. So this is larger than the entire US economy. It's second only to China's emissions. If it were a country, it'd be the second biggest emitter on Earth. So it's very large, very important. And I will argue in a minute, a very fast acting solution to climate change is to stop this deforestation. But it's also large and very, very important. So deforestation is obviously a large carbon source. That's really critical. But another thing is going on at the same time. This gets a little confusing. When we burn down a forest, it becomes a carbon source. But if we leave a forest alone and don't touch it, it actually acts as what we call a carbon sink. It absorbs some carbon. So forests on Earth today actually have two entirely different things going on at the same time. Where we tear down a forest, when humans get involved and muck up a forest and deforest it, it becomes a source of carbon. Deforestation on Earth today emits about 5 to 6 gigatons or billion tons of CO2 per annum. If we were to put this on a map, this is an estimate of, on a per pixel basis, basically, of how much carbon is emitted from forest all over the world in purple. The darker the purple, the more emissions from deforestation. But that's only the human side of the story. Nature, at the same time, if we leave the forest alone, forests absorb carbon all by themselves and naturally sequester a lot of carbon, about twice as much as we emit from deforestation, roughly 11 to 12 gigatons of CO2 per year. Why? Forests shouldn't be doing this, but they do now because we've changed the atmosphere above the forest. The CO2 in the atmosphere every single year goes up a little bit more, which stimulates photosynthesis of plants around the world. For most plants on Earth, the C3 plants, which all trees are. This is called CO2 fertilization. It's basically giving our trees on Earth a little steroids to grow a little bit more every year than they did before. There are a few other places that are regrowing forest from past disturbance. There are a couple of places where nitrogen pollution from rainwater might also be stimulating some forest growth, but mainly it's the effects of CO2. And that's a kind of green blanket all over the planet. Wherever there's natural forests left, we are stimulating a little bit more growth than we did before. So now we have this balancing act. Forests on Earth do two things. The natural forests we leave alone absorb carbon, and a lot of it, thank goodness. Where we interfere with forests and burn them down, deforestation releases about 5 to 6 billion tons of carbon. On net, overall, forests still absorb a lot of carbon, but not as much as they would if we left them alone. So cutting deforestation not only cuts a big source, it helps preserve a very large sink of carbon as well. So this is a map kind of showing net what forests are doing. The green areas are good. That's absorbing carbon forests. The purple areas are not. That's where we're cutting down the forests, turning them back into a source. So our overriding goal together should be to stop deforestation sources while we also preserve natural forest as sinks. And so we have to think about these things in tandem. One more question that comes up a lot, though, is should we be focusing on stopping deforestation today, the forests that are being cut down and burned right now? Or should we be planting forests for the future and restoring forests that were cleared already? Well, we should do both, of course. But as a scientist, I would have to say that both are helpful, but stopping deforestation is more important. Why? Well, as I showed you before, we burn a forest, immediately all of that carbon goes into the atmosphere. On day one, you burn the forest, poof, goes into the atmosphere. If you stop deforestation, all of that carbon never got emitted, and you get all that benefit on day one without doing anything. If you just simply didn't burn down the forest, you suddenly get all of that carbon benefit right away. But restoring the forest takes time. It takes years for it to accumulate forest again. Trees take decades to grow. Not cutting down a tree doesn't take any time at all. So there's a time asymmetry here. That's why we call preventing deforestation kind of an emergency brake climate measure. It happens instantly, far faster than any other climate solutions can. Where restoring forests are important, but it'll pay off in future decades. And that's important too, but when time is against us, I think we should focus a bit more on stopping deforestation as maybe as a second tier of work is then restoring the forests that have been cleared so far. Let's do both, but stopping deforestation is paramount. So how do we do that? Well, that's what Forest People Climate is all about, and you'll be hearing from the real experts on this in a few minutes. But ways we can protect forests that seem to work do include many different approaches. First and foremost is working with the local communities that have been shepherding these forests for years, especially indigenous communities. We can also find carbon markets that maybe have more integrity than the ones we've worked with so far to shift capital and move it into places so we don't burn forests, that we can keep them intact. We need to shift finance away from deforestation heavy activities like mining, like agricultural deforestation, and so on, and towards forest positive activities. And we also need to monitor and maintain good supply chains that don't traffic in deforestation linked commodities. Those are all important areas that we can focus on. FPC does this all, and you'll hear much more about it in a few minutes. As well as focusing on 3 key regions, they have 4 incredibly important strategies working with indigenous and local communities, working with carbon markets, private finance, and better supply chains, as well as 2 supporting strategies to help civil society do a better job with these forests and beyond, and communicating the critical importance of climate action and deforestation prevention to the world. So what's next? Well, next we're going to hear from our partners and from some others at Project Drawdown and dive into these key regions and these key strategies. And you'll be learning a lot more about this very important Forest People Climate Collaborative in this initiative. But next, I'd like to introduce my colleague, Dan Jasper, who's going to talk about the policy aspects of deforestation and what we need to know beyond the science to understand the international diplomacy and international governance that focuses on forests and their important links to climate and beyond. So Dan, please take it away.
Thank you, John. Really appreciate that presentation. I learn something every time I hear it. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen here. So hopefully that'll come up in a second here. Wonderful to be with you all here this evening, this morning, this afternoon, wherever you may be. As John said, I'm Dan Jasper. I'm Project Drawdown Senior Policy Advisor. And as you can see, I'm going to talk a little bit about forests and policy. What I want to do is just give you sort of a brief overview of, excuse me, some of the policy actors in this space, as well as some of the general policy options that you hear talked about in the forest arena. The point of this talk is not to inundate you with new acronyms and treaty bodies and world pledges, that kind of stuff. There's not going to be a quiz at the end, I promise you. I just want to give you a sense of how central forests are to the international policy and legal realms. On top of that, I want to give you some context for why FPC is designed the way that it is. And I think that'll become clear as we walk through some of this stuff. So the first point I want to make here is that forests are incredibly central, as I mentioned. And it's not just in the climate, biodiversity, and climate spheres, it's also in the human well-being, development, and human rights spheres as well. So given how central forests are to the international policy and legal realm, there are a plethora of treaties, resolutions, commitments, declarations, etc., that touch on forests. But if I had to boil it down to one thing that I want you to walk away from my presentation with, it would be that the sort of North Star goal of deforestation would be ending deforestation by 2030. This goal is explicitly endorsed by a few commitments. It overlaps and is supported by a number of other international agreements. But this is really our North Star goal in the same way that like the Paris Agreement sets the 1.52 degree warming as our North Star climate goal. This is our North Star for forests. This is also the reason why FPC set 2030 as their deadline to meet their goals to be in alignment with this. And as you'll see, 2030, the end of the decade, is really the sort of, it's the deadline for most international agreements. So it's a very important time, incredibly important decade. So let me just kind of give you a quick sample platter of some of the institutions you may encounter in this space. And then, like I said, some general policy options that'll sort of fill in some of the components around FPC. The first body that I want to mention here is one that you're probably familiar with. It's the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. Convention, by the way, is a fancy word for treaty. UNFCCC is the body that hosts the big climate talks once a year. It's also the body that produced the Paris Agreement. So think of the Paris Agreement as sort of a child of the UNFCCC. Within the Paris Agreement, there are pledges to protect carbon sinks and forests to help aid in that 1.52 degree limit to warming goal I mentioned earlier. And a few years after the Paris Agreement was signed at COP26, leaders issued what was called the Glasgow Declaration on Forests and Land Use. At the time, 140 countries signed on almost immediately, and it was a pledge to halt and reverse forest loss and land degradation by 2030. So that's where the North Star goal really comes from. It comes out of this body here. Notably, last year at COP28, leaders reaffirmed that Glasgow Declaration, and they pledged to enhance their efforts around deforestation. Now, really what that is kind of an indication that we can expect this conversation to pick up, that leaders will be focusing on it more in the future. And we do know that that will be the case. Next year, COP30 will be held in Brazil, and the Brazilians have made it abundantly clear that next year will be the forest COP. So we do expect this conversation to really pick up over the next year and a half or so. So you're kind of in on the ground floor here. Similarly, a sort of sibling to the UNFCCC, if you will, is something called the UN Convention on Biological Diversity, or CBD. In the same way that the UNFCCC produced the Paris Agreement, the CBD produced something called the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework. And this produced something called the 30 by 30 goal you may have heard of. It's basically a pledge to protect 30% of land and oceans by 2030. So you can see that that sort of overlaps and supports that North Star goal, but it's not quite the same thing. Now, sort of third triplet in this triplet of treaties, if you will, is the UN Convention to Combat Desertification, or UNCCD. This is an incredibly important treaty. It's the only international agreement that deals with things like drought, so it will become increasingly important. It recognizes the role of forests in regulating dry land. It also recognizes degradation as it relates to socioeconomics. And so this treaty is a nice sort of bridge between the environmental and human well-being components. Now, the three treaties I just mentioned are what's known as the Rio Conventions. They were signed in 1992 in Rio, and they're sort of the big three when it comes to climate and environment. So it's no accident that all three of them touch and focus on forests to some degree. Now, most people aren't actually aware that the UN has its own deliberative body focused on forests. I always say, you know, you made it as an issue area when you get your own deliberative body. It is probably both a blessing and a curse. But this body really exists to strengthen political commitments around deforestation and forest management. It talks about implementation, offers technical advice. This is also the place where they hash out What does it mean to do things like sustainably manage a forest? What is the definition that we can use globally for that? On top of that, this forum works with those 3 treaty bodies I just mentioned to implement their resolutions and their goals. Now, kind of switching gears to the human well-being side of this, we can look at the UN Sustainable Development Goals. The Sustainable Development Goals, or SDGs, were signed in 2015, and they're meant to be accomplished by 2030. So there it is, again, 2030 goal, even in the human well-being side. Now you can see probably right off the bat that a lot of them relate to forests. The first and foremost is number 15, life on land. It actually includes a sub-goal to increase forest area by 3% worldwide by 2030. So again, it supports that North Star goal, but is a little bit weaker. But on top of that, you can see that so many of these goals relate either directly or indirectly to forests. You can look at climate action, no poverty, good health and well-being, gender equality, clean water, as John pointed out, responsible consumption, sustainable communities, on and on. You can see just how central forests are to the human well-being component just by looking at the SDGs. Okay, one last body, I promise. This one actually requires a full slide to give you the full name, but everybody asked me what the acronym stands for, so I'm just going to go ahead and give it to you. I will let you read that on your own. As you can see, it rolls right off of the tongue. Everybody knows this program is UN RED. UN RED started in 2008. It is the UN's advisory platform for forest solutions as it relates to the climate crisis. It is a collaboration between these 3 UN agencies, and everybody kind of really knows it as the UN's official carbon credit scheme for forests. Now, there are different iterations and different ways that you can get carbon credits from the UN RED program. So you'll hear different iterations of that name. Probably the most famous you'll hear is something called RED Plus. And the reason it's sort of a little bit more famous than the rest is because it goes beyond stopping deforestation and into restoration and management, as John was pointing out. So it makes that comprehensive view. And again, I'll point out that this is kind of why FPC has that comprehensive view, because restoration and management were sort of missing from the conversation early on in the forest world. UN RED is not without its controversy. There are many critiques of its approaches, especially with regard to its treatment of Indigenous peoples' rights. And then again, this is why it's so critical that FPC is focusing on things like integrity in carbon markets and Indigenous peoples' rights, because there have been mistakes made in the past. And I think FPC is really doing a lot to witness that and to address it going forward. There will be more on carbon credits in just a minute from Tina, so I'll leave it here on the UN RED program, but happy to get into more in the Q&A. For now, I kind of want to wrap this up with just some general policy levers that are usually discussed in the forest realm. Now, I personally sort of divide these into the micro and macro spheres, and I think probably in the years ahead, you may hear it divided in similar terms. But in the microsphere, you can think of it as we have a forest and we want to protect it from all these external forces. What can we do? At the macro level, it's more, we have an economy and there's a forest within that economy. What are the things we can do at that 30,000-foot level that'll protect it? So the micro view is probably the most well-examined of the 2 options, and I'll spend a little bit more time on the micro view because it's a little bit more pertinent to what we're talking about here today. There's usually 4 options that most people talk about at this sort of micro view. The first is decreasing the value of agriculture. So if you decrease the value of agricultural products, you decrease the incentive for deforestation. Perhaps the easiest way you could go about this is removing subsidies, which artificially inflate the value of agricultural products and artificially reduce the value of standing forests. So that brings me to the flip side of this coin and our second policy option, which is increasing the value of standing forests. That one's a little bit difficult, but that's where carbon markets come in. They really try to put a quantity and a monetary value on what it means to have standing forest. A third option is regulating land use. You can put up fences, you can put up armed guards, and while we know that works, it does require the leadership of the Indigenous communities in these forests and the communities that surround them. In the past, there have been efforts that put up fences, armed guards, and even kicked Indigenous people off their land. And later, people were surprised to find out that the forest degraded. And that's because the Indigenous people were managing these forests and are part of that ecosystem. So while it works, it requires considerable attention and leadership from those on the ground and in these communities. And again, FPC has done a wonderful job at sort of addressing that within the full spectrum of their solutions. A fourth and final option in this microsphere is some sort of cross-sectoral approach. You could take some sort of combination of the three policy options I just mentioned. Now, lastly, I just want to quickly mention the macrosphere. And this, again, is being increasingly looked at, so you don't see it as much in the literature. This is being more looked at the IMF World Bank level. And it includes policy options like stimulating alternative sectors. We know, for instance, that if you stimulate the manufacturing sector in Rio, that can pull labor from businesses that drive deforestation, especially the illegal ones. So even though Rio is in a different region than the Amazon, it can still work. And we do know that through the work of the World Bank. Similarly, you can consolidate agricultural sectors in particular regions. So for example, if you consolidated the agricultural sector in the south of Brazil, that could go a long way in protecting the Amazon. And then lastly, you can look at things like import-export controls, as well as exchange rates. And that's really trying to diversify economies that have been locked or become over-reliant on particular goods. And John mentioned, Brazil is a good example as being a little bit over-reliant on soybeans and beef. What are those things you can do at the 30,000 foot level that'll sort of unstick that economy? So there's a few examples. I'm happy to get more into this in the Q&A if there's questions. But for now, I'm going to wrap up and I'm going to hand it over to Tina for a conversation on carbon markets.
Well, thanks, Dan. Dan's talked about it a couple of times, and really no discussion of tropical forest protection and restoration is complete without mention of carbon credits in the carbon market. Carbon credits have been and can still be an important financial tool for forest protection, but they've also been in the news lately, and not always in a good way. Here's a 2021 article from the World Economic Forum, written by the CEO of Verra, an organization that develops and manages standards for the voluntary carbon market. The article reported that by the end of 2020, 77 forest protection projects were registered under its verified carbon standard, with 185 million carbon credits issued. Fast forward 2 years, and here is the 2023 expose from The Guardian. Hannah, can you back up the slides, please? Thank you. Fast forward to 2023, and here's the expose from The Guardian, reporting on the investigation of the carbon credit projects approved by Verra. Based on interviews, analyses, and on-the-ground reporting with scientists, industry insiders, and indigenous communities, they found that for the majority of the projects, emissions reductions from forest conservation were being overestimated. This report and others, back it up, Hannah, slowed the growth of the carbon market for forest protection. But these investigations also prompted the multiple efforts that are now underway to improve its integrity. So whether you improve of carbon credits or the carbon market or not, they're an important and likely growing tool for halting and reversing forest loss. Here's why. Next slide, Hannah. As John mentioned, deforestation is responsible for 11% of global greenhouse gas emissions. If deforestation were a country, it would be the second largest emitter on the planet, after China and before the United States. Next slide. Even though we know how important stopping deforestation is, I apologize for my dog, to meeting our climate goals, deforestation rates remain stubbornly high, as this analysis from the World Resource Institute shows. Part of the reason we've not made more progress is that efforts to stop deforestation and forest loss are seriously underfunded. According to the Forest Declaration Assessment, less than 1% of the finance needed to protect and restore forests is currently being met. Next slide. So here's the good. Carbon credits and the carbon market are a way of routing badly needed money towards climate action and forest protection. Done right, carbon credits and the carbon market could be important tools for protecting tropical forests. Next slide. But only if they can be designed and deployed with high environmental and social integrity. The bad is that we now understand that there have been some serious problems with the environmental and social integrity of carbon credits and the carbon markets. So that's what needs to be fixed. Next slide. Before we dive more deeply into this challenge, I want to just take a few minutes to give you some of the basics about carbon credits and the carbon market. Carbon credits are measurable, verifiable emissions reductions from certified climate action projects, such as protecting a forest from being logged. One tradable carbon credit equals 1 metric ton of carbon dioxide equivalent emissions that are reduced, sequestered, or avoided. Next slide. There are two types of carbon markets. The voluntary carbon market supports issuing, buying, and selling of carbon credits on a voluntary basis. The compliance carbon market is to help entities meet national, regional, or international policy or regulatory requirements. The current supply of voluntary carbon credits comes mostly from private entities or governments that develop carbon projects to generate either emissions reductions or emissions removals. Demand comes from private individuals, corporations, or other actors. Next slide. So now let's explore the bad and focus on how to fix the problems that have been revealed for carbon credits in the carbon markets. Next slide. Reviews of many carbon forest projects have been revealed two broad problems. The first is that promise or projected emissions reductions have been overstated. The second, next slide, is that many projects have harmed the indigenous and local communities that live in the project area. Both of these types of problems, which Dan also mentioned, reflect failures in governance, transparency, tracking, and verification. Next slide. So last year, the Integrity Council for the Voluntary Carbon Market, a nonprofit independent governance body, released the core carbon principles. This is not the only effort underway to develop rigorous and credible standards. There are others, but the core carbon principles were developed with input from hundreds of organizations to set a global benchmark for high integrity in the voluntary carbon market, with rigorous thresholds for disclosure and sustainable development. In addition to improved governance, tracking, and transparency, the principles lay out some specific criteria for emissions reduction claims. Carbon accounting, the key element of Principle 7, is tough enough in most circumstances, but it's particularly challenging in natural systems like forests. Estimating the amount of carbon a forest sequesters is a labor-intensive job. However, advances in remote sensing and interpreting and validating carbon measurements from satellite and drone imagery are making this somewhat easier. The tougher problem is additionality, Principle 5. For example, was the forest actually at risk from deforestation? If not, then protecting it doesn't really reduce emissions. Ditto if protecting one area of forest just shifts deforestation activity somewhere else. This issue of being able to reliably forecast the future of the forest and what would have happened to it without the carbon credit project has been at the core of overestimating emissions reduction. The principles also recognize that carbon credits can't just be about climate change. In almost any system in which we're trying to reduce emissions, there are people involved and potentially affected by that action. This is particularly true in the tropical forest areas in the global south. Principle 9 says that carbon credit projects need to consider social and environmental co-benefits and risks. Does the project comply with all the legal requirements in the jurisdiction where it's located? Does the project provide additional environmental and social benefits, such as protecting biodiversity, improving livelihoods of local communities, or improving air quality? Next slide. The core carbon principles are an important step forward, but they do not directly address what I'm going to argue to you is the ugly of carbon credits in the carbon market. Many companies and individuals use carbon credits to compensate for or to offset their own greenhouse gas emissions. Essentially, they subtract the emissions reduced by some carbon credit funded project implemented somewhere else from the emissions they produce through their own activities or value chains. They're trying to make it look like they're reducing their emissions when they're really not. Well, this is a problem because getting to net zero is a global endeavor. We can't just trade emissions production in one place for emissions reduction in another. So the bottom line is that purchasing carbon credits is a valuable thing to do if the carbon credits that you buy are aligned with the core principles, and if you don't use them to offset emissions that you should be working to reduce instead. Next slide. Finally, I want to mention that ensuring that the voluntary carbon market has high social and environmental integrity is a key strategic priority of the Forest People Climate Collaborative, and a key element of their broader strategic approach to shift finance and markets to favor standing forests. Next slide. Their work on this problem is quite comprehensive. It includes improving the integrity of the voluntary carbon market with infrastructure rules, transparency requirements that require high integrity carbon credits. Next slide. It's also about improving the integrity of the supply by creating the capacity and conditions to improve development and increase the supply of high integrity carbon credit projects. Next slide. It's also about implementing finance to provide investments needed for jurisdiction, Indigenous people, and local communities to protect forests. And next slide. And it's also about encouraging the demand for high integrity carbon credits and carbon markets, and to build narratives to positively shift the global perception of the voluntary carbon market. Next slide. I'm going to stop here and also say thank you to John and Dan for such an informative presentations and discussion, and to thank you all who shared questions already. Please continue to do so throughout this session, and we'll do our best to answer as many questions as possible in the allotted time. We plan to address major questions remaining that we're not able to get to in our written follow-up post-deep dive communication with you. So the first question goes to John. It says, I'm interested in the research that shows that after 25% of a forest is cut down, the entire forest can become a carbon source rather than a carbon sink. I understand the Amazon is at 19% forest loss. Can you talk about these tipping points, especially how we prioritize forests that are closest to these tipping points?
Yeah, that's a great question. There are actually kind of two competing issues going on here. Whether a landscape is a net source of carbon or a net sink of carbon is just the ratio of how much is it being burned versus how much is being left alone to grow and continue to absorb carbon. So in the Amazon, when it gets to a certain percentage, it may become a net source or net sink, just depending on the math of how much is going up and how much is coming back down somewhere else. Without them interacting at all, there's a balancing act going on simultaneously. The question of a so-called tipping point is a different question. That relates to a different issue. Remember how I talked about how forests tend to recycle their own rainwater and influence the regional climate around them physically, not just from adding CO2 or taking it out of the air, but also in terms of regulating the flows of water and energy and wind pattern circulations. The Amazon, for example, kind of makes its own weather, as does the Congo, as does the Indonesian archipelago, thanks to these forests. So the concern is if you start to chip away at the edges of these forests more and more and more, they start to dry out a little bit more and get less rainfall penetrating the interior of the forest, for example. So the concern about a tipping point in the Amazon was first discussed by Carlos Nobre in Brazil, an incredible climate scientist, as well as Tom Lovejoy, now deceased sadly, but one of the world's leading biodiversity scientists. They were initially proposing this idea that if you deforest too much of the Amazon, it can kind of flip the weather patterns over the other healthy parts of the Amazon you never cut down, so that the even though you maybe have a very large intact area of forest still, it no longer rains there sufficiently. It has more frequent droughts and therefore more fires. So those are two kind of different ideas. Whether a landscape is a net source or net sink is one issue, but this additional complex issue of a tipping point in the Amazon in particular is of real concern. Right now, there's no very clear evidence one way or the other that it's happening right now or exactly where that threshold is. Sadly, we probably won't know until we cross it, but it is very, theoretically and I think empirically a real possibility and one that is kind of terrifying. And so that's why stopping Amazonian deforestation is such a high priority that if we don't, you can't wait till 99% of the forest, at some point it may flip the rest of the forest you left intact into basically a burning savanna, which would be pretty devastating for climate, biodiversity, and of course the region's watersheds and beyond. The Congo Basin in Indonesia, just because of the kind of layout of their continents and how the circulation patterns of the atmosphere work there, are less likely to have the same kind of tipping points. But the Amazon, because of its kind of unique geography, is almost designed to have this kind of phenomenon. And so it's something that keeps us up at night a little bit.
Thank you, John. The next question is for Dan. Dan, how can consolidation of the agricultural sector prevent deforestation, particularly in Brazil? Won't large conglomerates have greater power to influence government actions?
That's a wonderful question. And I will admit that it's a newer sort of piece of the literature that's just coming out of the World Bank. And if I remember correctly, it had more to do with if you designate a region where that's agriculture, it's kind of in the realm of regulating land use, right? You're kind of putting the sector down. In terms of their influence over government actors, that's a really good question. And I have to admit that I don't know the answer to it. I will just say that it was an option that was presented and is being explored at that macro level. So it wouldn't surprise me if there were serious conditions that it needed to be met for that to be successful. So it's a really good point, and I think it's something that you should keep in the back of your mind if you do engage on that. Sorry, I don't have a clearer answer than that.
Thanks, Dan. The next question goes to John, sort of following along the agricultural theme here. With growing agricultural demands, do you see emerging forestry principles and regenerative soil practices as a way to go?
Primarily in these forest areas, like especially the Amazon, we're just talking about, there's no need whatsoever to be clearing them for beef production or soybean production. That's just ridiculous. One, they're not really needed. These are not the base of food security for the world's poorest people. They're basically big commodity agriculture. They're just kind of ripping some profits out of the ground for a little while. I think the best thing to do is stop deforesting the area. Shifting the agriculture to a different region is probably the right approach, but I'm not sure a regenerative pasture in the middle of the Amazon is just as bad as a regular pasture in the middle of the Amazon. It doesn't, it should be a forest and should be left alone. Would be how I'd talk about that. So it's really about the geography of the location of the agriculture, not the practices themselves in the deforested regions. Elsewhere, yes, of course, changing agricultural practices in areas that are well away from forest edges and not contributing to net deforestation. Yes, different practices are definitely worth exploring and could be much better. But the principal problem here is cutting down the forest.
Let's continue on that theme, John. Since natural forests take a longer time span to grow back, what other innovative solution can be implemented to support reforestation? For example, urban forestry?
Well, trees just simply take some time to grow. It turns out they're not really limited by seed planting, things like this. Natural forests regenerate pretty quickly through natural seed dispersal. So I know people get excited about like drones flying over the forest, planting seeds and dropping seedlings down. I'm like, yeah, that can help a little bit, but often just leaving things alone and letting the birds do the work works just fine. It's just trees take decades to grow. So I would say the reforestation work is, very important, of course, but in a finite world of finite resources and time, I think all of these things could grow. We shouldn't have deforestation and reforestation shouldn't have to compete for a small sliver of support and work. We should grow both of them. It's not either or, it should be both and, but especially the stopping deforestation, because the time and benefit of stopping deforestation is given to you all on day one. It's a wonderful present from Mother Nature. You didn't have to grow a forest because it already exists. Just please don't cut it down. The regrowing forest is absolutely important too, and maybe, it could be targeted to regions where they have especially important benefits to carbon, but also to watersheds, to biodiversity, and as might have been mentioned, as mentioned, perhaps it would be also a good thing to look at is like urban heat islands where people are living. Putting vegetation canopies into cities can help protect people from extreme heat waves. The urban heat island effect that kind of amplifies a heat wave which are becoming more frequent anyway because of climate change. But those local areas with no forest cover can make those especially bad. So yes, regrowing forest in urban areas might have some especially good benefits, but it shouldn't compete for stopping deforestation. We have to do both.
Great. Thanks, John. We have time for one more question for Dan. Are there any priority regions or countries for tropical forest protection on target to meet their commitments? Who are the leaders and the laggards?
Oh, this is another good question, which I do not have the data to support, but I will say Brazil is the case that I'm most familiar with. And I will say that since Lula took over, there has been a drastic decrease in deforestation, but we still have work to do for sure. My estimation, and someone can correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't know that Indonesia has seen the same level of progress as Brazil. So Brazil next year, as I mentioned, COP30 will be a particularly important time. I will note that there were countries are now handing in what's called their GHG inventories. Some countries are lagging and handing those in. So we will have those numbers probably by the end of the year, and we can look at that data a little bit more. But as far as I can tell you off the top of my head, Brazil is making progress with Lula at the helm, but there's still more work to do.
Thank you, Dan and John, for those answers. And thank you all in our audience for these really great questions. We need to move on to other sections of today's session. So please keep submitting your questions. We'll answer what we can throughout the meeting and summarize some additional responses in written follow-up. Hannah, could you put up the next slide, please? So before I introduce and pass the mic to our colleagues at the Climate and Land Use Alliance and the Forest People Climate Collaborative, I just wanted to spend a couple of minutes to pull together what we've discussed so far and to set the stage for our next discussions. The objective of our deep dive workshops is to tackle this question: how do we unlock and accelerate climate action? For any particular climate problem, whether it's forest loss or fossil fuel power generation, we already know what needs to be done. And as we've learned earlier today from John's presentation, when it comes to halting and reversing forest loss, we also have a really good idea of where and when we should be taking action to have the greatest impacts. We also know that in most cases, taking action can yield other benefits to nature and human well-being. This type of information is useful. Next slide. Or to use the terminology that may be more familiar with you, it's actionable. But to unlock and accelerate climate action, this is still just the first step. Next slide. To make actionable information implementable, we need more and different kinds of information, including understanding the environmental and societal systems in which we need to work. For example, for most climate solutions, including forest protection, it is unfortunately useful to ask, why have we not made more progress? What are the obstacles that are preventing or delaying action? Is there a window of opportunity or a sensitive intervention point that we've missed? Next slide. This kind of investigation can provide you with situational awareness of the problem and the arena in which you want to take action. This enables you to develop a strategy. That strategy can combine your information on the what, where, when, and what else will result from your action with two more important elements: the how and the who. Next slide. For the how, there are lots of different kinds of levers to push to affect change in a system. Think of levers as tactical interventions designed to influence behavior or compel action by key actors, like governments, businesses, markets, or individuals. For example, levers can be public policy or government regulations. They can be a new technology or a shift in markets or finance, or they can be changes in social, culture, or behavior. For any climate action, different strategies will be most responsive to different levers. So to unlock and accelerate action, you need to select the right lever to implement your strategy. Next slide. Along with identifying the best lever to push, you need to determine who is the best actor to push that lever. This is an important question because different actors, whether they're philanthropists, investors, businesses, or government decision makers, can push, control, or influence different levers. Therefore, for any particular climate solution, the best way to unlock and accelerate action is to match the right actors with the right levers. Next slide. And this, in a nutshell, is why we're so glad that you, our community of businesses, investors, and philanthropic actors, have joined us for this deep dive into how to unlock and accelerate action to protect forests. And it's also why we're really glad to be able to partner with the Climate and Land Use Alliance and the Forest People Climate Collaborative for this deep dive, because they've done all this work to develop a comprehensive, multifaceted strategic program designed to work with multiple actors to push a variety of levers to halt and reverse forest loss within this decade. And so with that, it is my very great pleasure to introduce Lindsay Allen, the Executive Director of the Climate and Land Use Alliance, to share an overview with you of the Forest People Climate Collaborative. Lindsay, over to you.
Great. Thank you, Tina, and everyone on the Project Drawdown team. And thank you all for joining us for this session. So as Tina mentioned, I will talk a little bit more about emerging opportunities to protect forest and advance sustainable development as an introduction to the Forest People Climate Collaborative. And I do want to note that in addition to this session, we've mentioned 2 other sessions which have been recorded and will be shared. One focuses really specifically on the role of philanthropy as it relates to our 3 regional strategies, our 3 priority regions, which are the Brazilian Amazon, Indonesia, and the Congo Basin. And then there's another recording that is focused on the Forest People Climate Supply Chain Strategy, which looks at, and we hear from partners on that call, looking at how commodities coming from forests can be having a negative impact on forests or can have a more positive impact. So we follow those commodities out of forests and better understand that dynamic and what can be done to ensure forests remain standing. All right, so in terms of what we need to know now, so as we've heard, we have a major climate opportunity in forests because protecting forests can reduce more than 20% of global climate emissions. We also know that globally, Indigenous peoples and local communities manage 40% of intact forests and almost half of the lands that are in good ecological condition. And Dan mentioned some of these examples earlier. We also know that philanthropic funding is key, so it can move quickly to civil society organizations, and philanthropic support often comes with a far lower administrative burden when compared to public funding, and it can move quickly, which is critical. Yet less than 2% of global philanthropic giving goes to tackling climate. And of the philanthropic funding that does go to climate, resources are not being equitably distributed. So prior to launching the Forest People Climate Collaborative, we looked at some of this data. We looked at how is money flowing. And when we look at public money, we found some startling stats. So a 2019 assessment found that only 15% of development aid went to civil society organizations. And though that funding was intended for domestic uses, only 6%, so roughly 1 billion from a total of 142 billion, reached organizations based in the Global South. So even for the proportion of funding that was intended and went to civil society organizations, the vast majority of that funding remained in the hands of those organizations based in donor countries in the Global North, not those civil society organizations based in priority geographies. So this is consistent with trends that we see in private philanthropy and in terms of money moving from foundations. So we looked at another assessment prior to launching and creating Forest People Climate that was done in 2021. And that assessment found that despite their proven contributions to climate action, Indigenous peoples and local communities receive only a small fraction of the funding that was intended specifically to support Indigenous and local community land tenure and management. So at that time in 2021, less than 1% of funding for Indigenous issues went to Indigenous groups, we see that the majority of funding went to multilaterals and large international NGOs, as well as other intermediaries. So as we looked at all of that data, it was a very compelling case, knowing that this is a critical emergency brake to address climate, understanding the potential for sustainable development and just sustainable development, and looking at how the resources are not being distributed equitably. So that compelled us to launch the Forest People Climate Collaborative. So next slide. So FPC is a global collaborative of philanthropic donors, civil society, and community-based organizations that, as has been mentioned, we seek to halt and reverse tropical deforestation while advancing just sustainable development. We launched in 2022 with 13 leading philanthropies. And when we did, we announced a commitment to raise $2 billion in new funding to achieve this shared goal of halting and reversing forest loss while advancing sustainable development. With this collaborative, Forest People Climate Collaborative, we really seek to do three things. The first one, as I mentioned, we need to mobilize new funding. This is a critical lever for us to pull, this emergency brake. We know it can have really positive short-term impacts. And as we saw from the data that I mentioned, far too little of the funding is reaching the local level where we know resources can have a disproportionately positive impact. So of that $2 billion commitment, we're about halfway to our target. The second thing that the collaborative seeks to do is to develop a shared set of strategies. And I'll talk more about these in a minute. But what we found is that strategies were being developed in most cases by individual donors for every philanthropic institution, by individual non-governmental organizations for their specific contributions. And that can lead to a lack of strategic coherence and alignment around a shared vision and goal, which is not very useful when our goal is to achieve this by 2030. It can also create a lag in terms of being able to incorporate learnings and real-time developments in a way that's shared across the field. So we've helped to develop 9 detailed strategies with more than 600 stakeholders by asking the question, what will it take to halt and reverse tropical deforestation by 2030 and to advance just and sustainable development in those geographies? The third thing that the collaborative seeks to do is to ensure equitable support and to make sure that funds can reach the local level with a focus on those who have been historically excluded. So this I've mentioned a couple of times now, the long-term effectiveness of our strategies depends on local expertise, long-term engagement, and long-term investments. So there are 3 pathways that we use to help us think about how to protect forests. So 1, we need to keep forests standing. We need to safeguard tropical forests. And we need to do that by supporting the communities that are already stewarding and defending and managing those forests. So that's the first pillar. The second is we know that we need to shift finance. So finance and markets need to favor standing forests. So get rid of the funding that supports industries destroying forests and increase the amount of funding and financial incentives for the projects that protect forests. So we want to incentivize the good and get rid of the bad. And then we also know that we need really good public policy. So Dan mentioned some of the public policy levers. We need strong public support for those policies, and we need strong data that goes behind those policies. So our strategic framework, this is a nice area for us to partner with Project Drawdown, because in the way that Project Drawdown did this very comprehensive assessment in terms of what does it take to address climate change, we have done a comprehensive set of strategies to ask what does it take to halt and reverse forest loss by 2030. So there are 3 major geographies, and these have been mentioned throughout the call. One is the Brazilian Amazon. The Amazon is the largest tropical forest left in the world. 2 is focused on the Congo Basin, 5 countries of the Congo Basin, and 3 is focused on Indonesia. So we worked with more than 600 experts, primarily from tropical forest countries in the global south, with deep expertise on our issues to develop this set of strategies. And it provides a roadmap for grant making, action, monitoring progress, and learning. And those 3 geographic strategies are complemented by the 6 cross-cutting thematic strategies that have been mentioned. So we have 1 focused on Indigenous peoples, local communities, and Afro-descendants, 1 on supply chains. And as I mentioned, we did a recording on this that will be available. Another strategy on strategic communications, 1 on private finance, and as Tina mentioned, 1 on carbon market integrity. And then finally, we have a strategy that we call enabling conditions, which is really designed to look at the expansion of civic space, the protection of civic space that's needed, and how to increase the resiliency and effectiveness of organizations. So each of these strategies has the support of a network of local teams within these regions who have specialized expertise and relationships with organizations closest to our issues. And our focus as a collaborative is to ensure that their work is supported through generating new funding, having this strategic alignment, and helping to create outsized impact. So we're supporting the power of collective action. We want the space for learning and improving our effectiveness. And in summary, we know that this decade is a critical one for fighting climate change. We know that we have the opportunity to think about systems changes in order to protect forests and ensure that people thrive. So I hope you found this useful. And of course, there are 2 more deep dives that go into the content from the regional strategies and the supply chain strategy that might be of interest. But with that, I will stop and hand it over to my colleague, Caitlin, to take questions.
Great. Hi, everyone. My name is Caitlin Giblin, and I'm the Senior Advisor on Collaborations at CLUA. I'm going to moderate our final Q&A session for today. So thank you to Tina for sharing that framework on climate action, and to the whole Drawdown team for hosting us. And thank you, Lindsay, for that overview of the Forest People Climate Collaborative. And so we have some great questions from the audience to jump into. And if there's any that we don't get to, we'll aim to make sure we cover those in our follow-up materials. So let's see, Lindsay, our first question here is, how can philanthropists and philanthropy organizations in Asia help to halt tropical deforestation? And how does their role differ from that of impact investors and businesses?
Great question. So more of this is covered in the supply chain session, but I would say very high level, businesses have the opportunity to shift their practices directly in addition to making other investments that are positive. We think about it in a way similar to what Tina mentioned for carbon market integrity. So you can't just offset in order to not sort your own issues. We think about businesses, it's always a #1 priority, sort your emission drivers first and foremost. Impact investors, I think about in relationship to the finance and market strategy, where we know we need to incentivize the protection of forests, and we need to incentivize the industries and those that kind of generate local livelihoods and result in the protection of forests. And we need to decrease the financial incentives and move investments away from commodities that are driving deforestation and indigenous and human rights abuses. So that's what I think of the role of impact investors. Philanthropy, I think about philanthropic resources really differently. And it might be because I'm in philanthropy, so it's what I know a bit better. But we know that there is a lot of public money, but it gets stuck and it doesn't reach the local level. And the administrative burden can be high. It can be very slow. And so when we're looking at a 2030 deadline, we need philanthropic resources to get in there as first investments. We need them to get in there as higher risk investments. We need them to be investing in things where there's not going to be a near-term financial return specifically for those investments. And so in terms of what philanthropy can do, FPC was designed to make it as easy as possible for new donors in particular to come in on this set of issues and know that their resources are going to the right place. So we work with a whole set of regional and locally based regranters who can ensure resources reach the local level to remove that barrier around, I'm not sure where to move the money. And then we also can look at what the collective impact is going to be, because we're aggregating information and our indicators of effectiveness are shared. So we can look at that together and learn in terms of what is working and not working on the investments that are being made. And that should allow philanthropy again to kind of focus on the highest and best use of those philanthropic resources.
Great, thank you, Lindsay. So our next question from a participant is asking, I understand that food, agriculture, and land use emissions in Asia are about 50% higher than the global average. What are some of the particular levers of change in this region? And if you are thinking of them, are there organizations that you think are focused on this work that you'd want to highlight?
Yes. So there are dozens and dozens and dozens of organizations who are amazing, who are focused on this work. I am most familiar with Indonesia because Indonesia is such a critical geography in terms of global land use emissions. So I can't give as comprehensive of a regional response, but I know Indonesia pretty well. So one of the things that we've seen as a driver over time is related to palm oil expansion and pulpwood expansion or tree plantations. Those two drivers are the most significant, and it's what has caused some of the international incidents related to, for instance, the fires where the smoke and haze was affecting Singapore, and it kind of created this international incident. We saw that deforestation was expanding more quickly, if you look a decade ago, than in any other tropical forest country in Indonesia, because of those two drivers and because of the fires that were being intentionally set and because of the emissions from peat swamps that were burned when areas were cleared to make room for palm oil and for pulp plantations. What we saw as a result of domestic pressure, international pressure, regional pressure, the fallout from the fires, is that once there was a concerted effort, both by NGOs and by the government, to say, okay, this is not the development trajectory that we want to be on, where these industries expand and the benefits go to relatively few and the negative consequences are shared across the region and are felt acutely in areas where lands have been taken from indigenous peoples or other examples. We actually saw that there was good public policy that came out, and as a result of that, we've seen one of the most significant shifts in terms of deforestation rates in Indonesia. There are some things that are still a challenge. So one of the things I would highlight is, while expansion for palm oil has slowed, and that hasn't affected the international vegetable oil markets where palm oil is being used as for food uses, we are now seeing that there is a biofuels mandate that is increasing domestically within Indonesia that is expected to considerably put pressure on existing palm oil supply. So either the cost of vegetable oil, palm oil, is going to go up, and that's a food security issue, or there's going to be a drive to expand more forests, and that's a deforestation, climate, and human rights issue. So there are examples like that where there are broader coalitions that are working on the public policy lever, the financial lever, and the land use levers related to palm oil as an example of one of the key drivers.
Great, thanks, Lindsay. Can you share any examples of a particularly successful initiative in tropical forests, especially where there was local or national political opposition to those efforts?
Yes, that's a great question. So since I shared the example of palm oil in Indonesia, I will go to the Amazon basin. So we have seen that the number one driver of deforestation in the Brazilian Amazon is cattle. It has been for more than a decade, and it is currently. And the agribusiness sector is one of the most powerful political lobbies in Brazil. They have considerable political influence. When you look at the Amazon region, the amount that they spend on marketing is huge, and it's the NGO investments to kind of shift that power dynamic are dwarfed in comparison to the amount of political power and investment that's being made by the agribusiness sector. And yet, we have seen, and Dan mentioned this earlier, we saw that when Lula was in his first term, there was a real focus on creating the systems for monitoring what is happening in the forest and thinking about compliance. Then you had a Bolsonaro administration that was extremely friendly toward expansion into the Brazilian Amazon. And what we've seen is that the financial sector became particularly important, as did the power in certain states. So one of the examples that we use is one of the states in the Brazilian Amazon, which I think John mentioned as well, in Mato Grosso. It is one of the frontiers of expansion, and you can still see that when good investments are made at the state level in tracking and understanding products coming out of forests, and when you think about removing some of the financial incentives, the subsidies that make it easier to get money to clear lands and graze cattle than to do other things that are in and around the Amazon rainforest, we see that those things can come together and result in a decrease in deforestation. And we saw, although to a lesser extent, that there were certain geographies, even during a kind of deforestation-friendly administration, that could still maintain forest loss and decrease it slightly. So those are some of the good examples of what is possible. And now in Brazil, as was mentioned, we have a federal administration that is eager and extremely committed to making investments to halt and reverse forest loss. And we've already seen that by some of the data that's come out just a couple months ago based on numbers last year, where they're seeing really significant deforestation reductions in the Amazon again.
Great. Thank you, Lindsay. And thank you all so much for sending in these thoughtful questions. We need to start wrapping up today's session, but we appreciate your input, and we have some great follow-up materials coming soon. So I'm going to hand it back to Tina to close us out.
Thank you, Caitlin, and thank you, our audience, for those fabulous questions. And a huge thank you to our strategic partners, the Climate and Land Use Alliance, the Forest People Climate Initiative, Collaborative, Climate Lead, and also Tonic for supporting this deep dive. Please be on the lookout in the coming weeks for the session recording, the key takeaways, links, and more details on further engagement opportunities, as well as all of that information and additional answers to your questions. And thank you all again for joining us today. And also, finally, a huge thank you to all of our supporters, many of whom you see here, as well as our extended network of business and Capital Coalition members and partners. It's really been a great pleasure to share this hour and a half with you. Thank you for joining us on the deep dive, and we'll look forward to seeing you on our next deep dive.